What would you do if helping a frail old woman at the airport suddenly thrust you into a dangerous game of lies and secrets? For Josh, a simple act of kindness quickly spirals into a life-threatening situation where nothing, and no one, is what it seems. We would like to know where in the world you are watching from. Let us know in the comments below. The airport was buzzing with life, a constant hum of voices blending with the whine of engines preparing for takeoff. The sharp stereo lights reflected off the marble floors, and people moved in all directions, dragging suitcases and rushing toward their gates. Over the loudspeaker, flight announcements echoed every few minutes, urging passengers to hurry to their flights. Standing tall amidst the chaos was Josh, a man who seemed to command respect with every step he took. Dressed in a sharp, tailored suit and polished shoes that gleamed as he walked, Josh exuded confidence. He was a successful businessman, and his wealth had opened doors for him. Doors that he never imagined as a kid growing up in a small, tight-knit neighborhood. Everything about him spoke of success, from his gold watch to the way people looked twice as he passed by. But deep down, despite all the luxury and the comfortable life he now lived, Josh often felt like something was missing. He couldn't quite place it, but there were moments when he longed for the simplicity of his old life. The days when life was about family dinners, laughter with friends, and lending a hand to neighbors. Now it seemed everything was fast-paced, distant, and filled with endless responsibilities. He glanced at his phone, checking the time once more. His flight was in an hour, and he needed to get to the gate soon. It was a busy week ahead. Meetings with high-profile clients, big deals to close. Josh was mentally preparing himself, thinking about how to juggle all the demands, when something out of the corner of his eye caught his attention. An elderly woman, hunched over and moving slowly, was struggling with a large suitcase near the entrance to the security checkpoint. She seemed frail, her silver hair a cloud of wisps around her head. Her hands, shaky and weak, clutched the suitcase handle tightly as she tried to drag it, but it was clear she was losing the battle. The suitcase barely moved as she struggled to pull it inch by inch. Josh watched her for a moment, his heart stirred. She looked exhausted, her movements slow and labored, as if each step took more effort than the last. His eyes followed her as she stumbled slightly, her foot catching on the edge of the suitcase. A few people passed by her, but no one stopped to help. Everyone seemed too wrapped up in their own lives, rushing to their own flights, just like he was. For a second, Josh thought about just continuing on his way. He was a busy man, and he didn't have time to get involved in situations like this. He had worked hard to get where he was, and every minute counted. But then something tugged at him. Deep inside, a small voice whispered, reminding him of who he was before all the money, before all the success, the Josh who would never have walked by someone in need. He glanced at the old woman again. She had stopped now, resting her hand on the top of the suitcase, breathing heavily. Josh's feet moved before he could even make up his mind, his heart taking the lead where his mind hesitated. He walked up to her, his voice gentle as he spoke. "Excuse me, ma'am, do you need help with that?" The woman looked up, her eyes wide and surprised. Her face was lined with age, and her eyes, though tired, held a spark of warmth. "Oh dear, I didn't want to bother anyone," she stammered, her voice shaky. "It's no bother at all," Josh said with a smile, already reaching for her suitcase. "Let me carry this for you." She smiled, the lines on her face softening. "Thank you, son. My hands aren't what they used to be," she admitted, a little embarrassed. "I just need to get through security." Josh nodded and began walking beside her, carrying the heavy suitcase with ease. They made their way toward the security line, the pace slow as the woman shuffled beside him. He could feel the stares of people around him. Most were probably wondering why someone like him, so well-dressed and clearly in a hurry, would stop to help a stranger. But Josh didn't care. There was something about this old woman that reminded him of his grandmother, of the simpler times when people looked out for each other. Just as they approached the front of the security line, The loudspeaker blared to life again, this time announcing his flight's final boarding call. His stomach dropped. He had lost track of time while helping the woman, and now his flight was about to leave. For a moment, Josh stood frozen, his heart racing. If he missed this flight, it would throw off his entire schedule. He'd missed the meeting in New York, the one he had been planning for weeks. His mind raced with the consequences of being late, the disapproval of his clients, the deals that might fall through. But then he looked at the old woman beside him. She still smiled warmly, completely unaware of the inner conflict boiling inside him. She was so grateful for his help, and for some reason, Josh couldn't bring himself to leave her now. She needed him. His feet shifted as the tension built inside him. What should he do? Should he run and catch his flight, leaving the woman to fend for herself, or stay and help her get through security? Josh stood frozen as the loudspeaker blared his flight's final boarding call. His mind raced with all the reasons he should drop the old woman's suitcase and run to catch his plane. But something inside him wouldn't let him move. He looked at the frail woman beside him, her silver hair shimmering under the airport lights, her face calm but weary from the struggle of dragging her heavy suitcase. He couldn't leave her now. Taking a deep breath, Josh made his decision. "I'll help you get through security," he said firmly, even though his heart pounded with the knowledge that he might miss his flight. The woman, who had been watching him with a hopeful expression, broke into a relieved smile. "Thank you, young man," she said softly. "I was worried no one would stop to help an old woman like me. I'm Mrs. Smith, by the way." Josh smiled back, trying to push away the nagging voice in his head, reminding him of all he was sacrificing. "It's no problem, Mrs. Smith. Let's get you through security." He grabbed the handle of her suitcase and began leading her toward the checkpoint. As they approached the line, Josh couldn't help but notice the stares of people rushing by them. Some gave him sympathetic looks, while others seemed to wonder why someone like him, a man dressed in an expensive suit, clearly on his way to something important, was helping a stranger. But Josh didn't care. He was raised to always help those in need, and today Mrs. Smith needed him. Just as they reached the front of the line, Mrs. Smith started rummaging through her handbag, her brow furrowing in confusion. "Oh dear," she mumbled. "Where's my passport?" Josh's heart skipped a beat. "Your passport," he repeated, a slight edge of panic creeping into his voice. They couldn't get through security without it. Mrs. Smith's hands shook as she dug deeper into her handbag, pulling out tissues, a pen, an old receipt, everything but her passport. Her face paled, and Josh could see the worry growing in her eyes. "I had it when I left the house this morning," she stammered. "It must be here somewhere." Josh's stomach tightened. The seconds were ticking by, and his flight was slipping further and further from his grasp. He glanced toward the security line ahead. People were moving swiftly, scanning their passports and moving through without a hitch. But here they were, stuck, with Mrs. Smith frantically searching for something that seemed to have disappeared. "Okay, don't worry," Josh said, forcing calm into his voice. "Let's think. Where did you last see it?" Mrs. Smith looked at him, her eyes wide with fear. "I don't remember," she admitted, her voice cracking. "Maybe I dropped it somewhere on the way here." Josh took a deep breath, trying to keep his growing anxiety in check. He couldn't abandon her now, not when she was so distressed. "All right, let's retrace your steps," he said, scanning the bustling crowd around them. "Maybe we can find it." They turned back from the security checkpoint, their pace quickening as they walked along the path Mrs. Smith had taken. The airport was packed with travelers, all hurrying to their own destinations, oblivious to the panic that was building in Josh's chest. He tried to stay focused, but he couldn't help glancing at the clock. Every minute that passed was another minute closer to missing his flight. As they passed by the benches near the entrance, Mrs. Smith stopped suddenly, her face lighting up. "Oh, I remember now," she exclaimed. "I sat down here for a minute when I first came in. I might have left it on the seat." Josh's heart lifted with a flicker of hope, and they rushed to the spot she pointed out. But when they arrived, there was no sign of the passport. Only a crumpled newspaper lay on the bench. Mrs. Smith's face fell, and Josh's own hope began to fade. "We can't find it," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know what to do." Josh clenched his jaw, fighting the frustration bubbling inside him. He had given up so much time already, and now it seemed like they were running in circles. His instincts told him something wasn't right. How could Mrs. Smith have lost her passport so easily? Why was she traveling alone without anyone to help her? "Are you sure you had it when you got here?" Josh asked, trying to piece things together. Mrs. Smith hesitated for a moment, her eyes darting around nervously. "I thought I did," she said quietly, "but now I'm not sure." Josh felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Time was running out. If they didn't find the passport soon, she wouldn't be able to board her flight, and he would be stuck at the airport, missing his own. As they stood there in the middle of the busy airport, surrounded by people rushing by without a care, Josh looked at Mrs. Smith again. Her hands were still shaking, and her face was etched with worry. Something about the situation felt strange, but at the same time, he couldn't abandon her. He couldn't leave her in such a vulnerable state. "We'll figure this out," Josh said, though the doubt in his own voice startled him. He didn't know how much longer he could keep up this chase, but he also knew that walking away wasn't an option. He glanced at the clock one last time, feeling the finality of his missed flight sinking in. Whatever came next, he was now in it for the long haul, and there was no turning back. Josh stood with Mrs. Smith in the middle of the busy airport, his mind racing. They had searched everywhere, but the passport was nowhere to be found. Josh knew it was only a matter of time before the situation would get even more complicated. As much as he wanted to help, he couldn't shake the feeling that something strange was going on. Why was Mrs. Smith traveling alone? And why did she seem so unprepared? His instincts told him to be cautious, but he couldn't bring himself to abandon her. Just as he was about to suggest one last place to check, Josh noticed something strange. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw a man approaching them. The man was tall and lean, dressed in a crisp black suit that seemed too formal for the busy, casual atmosphere of the airport. His dark sunglasses hid his eyes, but his movements were swift and deliberate. There was an air of authority about him, but something about the way he walked made Josh uneasy. The man came to a stop just a few feet away, his eyes, what little Josh could see of them, locked onto Mrs. Smith. His expression was cold, almost emotionless, and it sent a chill down Josh's spine. "Mrs. Smith," the man said, his voice low and controlled. "You need to come with me." Mrs. Smith froze, her face turning pale as she took a step back. She gripped Josh's arm tightly, her fingers trembling. "No," she whispered under her breath, her voice barely audible. "Don't let him take me." Josh's heart raced. He had no idea who this man was, but Mrs. Smith's fear was real. He could feel it in the way she clung to him. The man's gaze shifted to Josh, his lips curling into a tight, almost threatening smile. "Who are you?" the man demanded, his tone sharp. "Why are you helping her?" Josh straightened his posture, trying to remain calm even though every instinct in him was telling him something was very wrong. "I'm just helping her get through security," Josh said cautiously, not giving away too much. "She lost her passport, and I'm trying to help her find it." The man's expression didn't change, but the tension between them grew. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "This isn't your concern," he said, his tone dripping with authority. "I'm with airport security, and Mrs. Smith is involved in a sensitive matter. It's best if you leave now." Josh's instincts screamed at him to back away, to walk out of this situation before it spiraled any further out of control. But something about the way Mrs. Smith held on to him, the fear in her eyes, made him hesitate. He glanced at her again, and she looked up at him, pleading silently. "Please," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Don't let him take me. He's not who he says he is." Josh's mind spun with questions. If this man wasn't really a security officer, then who was he? And why was he so determined to take Mrs. Smith? The more he thought about it, the less sense it made. Why would someone like Mrs. Smith be involved in anything dangerous or sensitive? She was just a harmless old woman, wasn't she? But there was something in her eyes that made Josh pause. Fear, real, raw fear. And that fear was contagious, seeping into Josh's own nerves. The man in the black suit stepped even closer, his voice now barely a murmur, but his presence overwhelming. "This is your last warning," he said, his tone dark. "Step aside. She's coming with me." Josh took a deep breath, trying to think clearly. He could see people in the airport walking by, completely unaware of the tense standoff happening just a few feet away. Part of him wanted to trust the man, after all. He could very well be telling the truth. Maybe this was all a misunderstanding. Maybe Mrs. Smith had done something that required security's attention. But the way she clung to him, her body trembling, made Josh doubt everything. "Why does she have to go with you?" Josh asked, his voice firmer now, though his heart pounded in his chest. The man's jaw tightened, clearly not used to being questioned. "That's none of your business," he snapped. "Now step aside, or I'll have to involve other authorities." Josh's eyes darted around. Involving more authorities might be the best option, but something told him this man wasn't about to make that call. His patience was clearly wearing thin, and Josh could feel the situation getting more dangerous by the second. Mrs. Smith tugged on his arm again, her eyes wide and desperate. "Please, Josh," she begged. "He's not who he says he is. I'm not safe with him. You have to believe me." Josh's heart wavered. He had no idea who to trust. The man in the black suit was growing more agitated, his stance becoming more aggressive, while Mrs. Smith's fear continued to mount. The airport buzzed around them, oblivious to the tension boiling over. He had to make a decision. If he stepped aside, he would be free to walk away, free to catch a later flight and get back to his normal life. But that meant leaving Mrs. Smith, trusting this stranger in a black suit who claimed to be security but didn't act like it. If he chose to protect her, he could be putting himself in danger. He could be involving himself in something far bigger than he ever imagined. The man took another step forward, now mere inches from Josh. His voice dropped, cold and threatening. "This is your last chance. Let her go." Josh swallowed hard, the weight of the decision crushing him. Something was definitely wrong, but he wasn't sure what. All he knew was that Mrs. Smith didn't feel safe with this man, and for some reason, Josh felt responsible for her now. He couldn't just leave her. "Sorry," Josh said quietly, standing his ground. "She's not going anywhere with you." The man's eyes flashed with anger, and Josh knew there was no turning back now. Josh's heart pounded in his chest as he made his decision. He wasn't going to let Mrs. Smith go with the strange man, no matter how official he seemed. He could feel the tension radiating from the man in the black suit, and he knew things were about to escalate. Without another word, Josh tightened his grip on Mrs. Smith's arm and took a step back, pulling her with him. "Come on," he whispered to her, trying to stay calm. "We need to get out of here." The man's cold gaze followed them, but for some reason, he didn't pursue immediately. Josh didn't waste time wondering why. He moved quickly, leading Mrs. Smith through the crowd, weaving between travelers and luggage carts. His mind raced, adrenaline pumping through his veins. He had no idea where they were going or how long they had before the man caught up, but he couldn't stop now. They ducked into a quieter part of the airport, away from the main hustle of the terminal. Josh found a small, dimly lit hallway near some vending machines. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than staying out in the open. He guided Mrs. Smith to a bench and sat her down, glancing back to make sure no one had followed them. Mrs. Smith was trembling, her frail hands shaking in her lap. She looked up at Josh, her eyes filled with gratitude, but also deep fear. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You didn't have to do this. You don't know what you've gotten yourself into." Josh knelt down beside her, still trying to catch his breath. "I couldn't just leave you with him," he said, his voice firm but kind. "Now tell me, what's really going on? Who was that guy? Why was he after you?" Mrs. Smith hesitated, her eyes darting around as if she expected the man to appear any second. Finally, she took a deep breath and began to speak, her voice shaky but determined. "I'm not just an old woman traveling alone," she said slowly. "I'm a witness. I saw something. Something terrible. There's a trial coming up, and I'm supposed to testify." Josh's eyes widened in shock. A witness? This frail old woman was caught up in something dangerous. He couldn't believe it. "The man chasing us," she continued, "he's not an officer. He works for the people I'm testifying against. They've been trying to stop me ever since they found out I was going to speak in court." Josh felt a chill run down his spine. Everything was starting to make sense now. The man's cold demeanor, his strange insistence on taking Mrs. Smith with him. He wasn't there to protect her. He was there to silence her. "They're trying to make sure I never make it to that trial," Mrs. Smith said, her voice breaking slightly. "I didn't mean to drag you into this, but I didn't know where else to turn." Josh sat back, stunned. He had thought he was just helping an old woman with a suitcase, but now he realized he was in the middle of something far more dangerous. His mind raced, trying to figure out what to do next. They couldn't stay here. Eventually, the man in the black suit would find them. Before Josh could come up with a plan, the sound of heavy footsteps filled the hallway. His heart dropped. He turned to see a group of uniformed police officers rushing toward them, their faces serious and alert. Josh's first instinct was to protect Mrs. Smith, but before he could react, the officers surrounded them. "Hands up," one of the officers shouted, but there was no aggression in his voice, just urgency. Josh slowly raised his hands, his mind spinning. Was this it? Had the man in the black suit called for backup? Was Mrs. Smith about to be taken away again? But then, something unexpected happened. The lead officer looked directly at Mrs. Smith and said, "Ma'am, we've been looking for you everywhere. Are you all right?" Mrs. Smith's tense body relaxed, and Josh blinked in confusion. The officers weren't here to arrest her. They were here to protect her. "We got word that someone was trying to intercept you," the officer explained, his tone professional but concerned. "You're safe now. We'll get you to the courthouse." Josh's heart slowly stopped racing as relief washed over him. The police had been searching for her all along. Somehow, in this chaotic mess, he had made the right choice. He had trusted his gut, and it had saved Mrs. Smith from falling into the hands of that dangerous man. The officers gently helped Mrs. Smith to her feet, and one of them turned to Josh with a nod of gratitude. "You did the right thing," the officer said. "We couldn't have found her without you. Thank you for stepping in." Josh nodded, still processing everything. As Mrs. Smith was escorted away, she turned back to him, her eyes soft with emotion. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You saved my life." Josh watched as she disappeared with the officers, feeling a strange mix of emotions, relief, pride, and a deep sense of fulfillment. He had missed his flight, sure, but none of that seemed to matter anymore. Helping Mrs. Smith, being there for her when no one else was, had given him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in a long time. As the crowd in the airport moved around him, Josh stood still, reflecting on what had just happened. His life had always been about business deals and deadlines, but today had been different. Today, he had done something that mattered on a deeper level. He had made a difference in someone's life. With a deep breath, Josh turned and began walking toward the exit. He had missed his flight, but as he left the airport, he knew this was a day he would never forget. Sometimes, helping a stranger can change your life in ways you never expect. In the end, Josh's decision to help changed everything, proving that even the smallest acts of kindness can lead to the most unexpected outcomes. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more like it, Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss out on our latest content. Let us know what you think in the comments, and stay tuned for more gripping stories.